Hello, thank you very much for asking me to talk to you today. I've got 20 minutes to talk about most of the risk factors for dementia, so you'll excuse me if I don't talk in great detail because I haven't got time. I'm talking about 2 Lancet Commissions, and the third is currently being written. I wrote some of it this morning, and they came not just from me, but from this group of people who internationally, so that we can think about different places and different expertise. I'm going to talk about why we should consider dementia preventable, a bit about dementia risks and what they are, and about what we should do. So, everyone knows that there are many more people living with dementia, and that the numbers are expected to go up from around 50 million in 2019 to 132 million in 2050. So a massive increase in people living with dementia, and that is because there are more older people, as fortunately fewer people die young. However, in high-income countries, in the last 20 years, there has been a 25% decrease in incidence. So there are more people in every country living with dementia. But if we look at the age-related incidence, a number per 100,000 of people, say between 70 and 80, there's been a reduction in 25%. Which is enormous. And if we had any drugs that would do anything like that, you can imagine that we'd be selling them everywhere. However, in some countries, the age-related incidence is increasing or stable, indicating that dementia is potentially, but not inevitably, decreasing. It matters what we do. And the mechanisms are thought to be 2 things of the decrease: cognitive reserve, and I'll talk to you in a second about what that is, and decreasing damages. And it's important to know that the improvements are in higher income, more educated people within high income countries, and in men more than women. So even within these high income countries that we've seen, like France, United States and the United Kingdom, there's considerable potential that has not been tapped in decrease. Also, there is potential for these things to be reversed as we live in a way which may not help. So I'm trying to explain what cognitive reserve. If you look at the bottom graph on the left-hand side, you can see that on average, people who have more neuropathology, more pathological changes in their brain are more likely to have dementia. But if you look at the other 4 graphs, so look at the one on the top left hand, you can see these are people who have died without any dementia, with high cognitive performance, and this is the amount of neuropathology. It overlaps with people who've died with severe dementia. So some people are able to tolerate neuropathology without developing dementia. And this is what we call cognitive reserve. And cognitive reserve is thought to be due to what's happening in the brain throughout life. Education is a really big part of it, but also throughout life we can continue to develop cognitive reserve. So it's a dynamic process, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Within the Lancet Commission, these are the 12 risk factors that we have identified as having enough evidence of the risk factor precedes the reduction in risk factor precedes dementia by enough years, but high quality, consistent evidence that they are related to dementia. And as you'll notice, there are different times in the life course, and that so that you were talking about we should think about midlife, but I would say it's never too early and it's never too late to make a difference in dementia. These are the 12 risk factors we were sure about. We know there are others, and we continue to be quite conservative about including them, making sure that the evidence is really good. And from them, we calculated the population attributable fraction, that is how much the risk factor, how much of dementia the risk factor accounts for. And that would be theoretically prevented by eliminating the risk factor. And it's calculated by the relative risk. So if something is highly risky, if having this risk factor makes you twice as likely to have it, it can make a big difference. And by the prevalence, how many people have that risk factor, and which, if either of them are large, it's likely to make a great deal of difference. And for each of them, we adjusted for communality. And now I can show you how to do that, but I really don't think you want to do the maths now. But the idea is that people are not like rats. People have multiple risk factors, and not only do they have multiple risk factors, they tend to cluster together. So it's more likely that the person with high blood pressure is obese, doesn't take exercise, and has diabetes. So if you just look at one thing, you will overcount the effect of that risk factor. From this 12 things, we came to this life course diagram, showing when in the life course these 12 factors make a difference and the amount of difference. And overall, they account for 40% of current dementias. So a massive possibility of making a change. This is worldwide figures. And I'd like you to look at these and to see that the one that makes the most difference, which I think may surprise you, is hearing. It surprised me. The second is education, and the third is cigarette smoking. And between them, they account for 20%. So that's half of the possible difference. And this just gives you an idea what happens if you correct. I don't want you to, if you look at the figure in red, that's the corrected figure. So education was 7.3, but if we hadn't corrected it for the fact that people with less education are more likely to smoke, are more likely to, are less likely to live in areas where it's safe to take exercise, are more likely to live in polluted areas because they haven't got choice, then it would have been 19.4. So just to get an idea of the method, that it makes a difference. I want to talk a bit more about hearing loss and hearing aids. So what we did for the Lancet is the first systematic review of the difference that not being able to hear in midlife made about dementia in late life. And we looked for high quality studies that measured people's hearing, that checked they didn't have dementia, follow up, that accounted for people's age, their sex, and their cardiovascular risk factors. And we found that it made about a 1.9. The increase was about 90% people with hearing loss in midlife. And that led really to people beginning to look a bit more closely to whether it really was potentially preventable. So at the end of last year, there was a paper in JAMA Neurology which looked at all of the different papers which had considered people using hearing aids, and they found that following up people using who used hearing aids, that they had a 19% lower risk of dementia compared to people who had lack of hearing and who didn't use them, and they had a 19% lower risk of cognitive decline and a 17% lower risk of dementia. So hearing aids really seem to make a difference. However, the question is, are people who use hearing aids more highly educated and have more money and more resources? Are they the people who are less likely to develop dementia anyway? And then this year, the UK Biobank followed up nearly 500,000 people who'd taken part in there, and they found there was no increased risk in dementia in those people who used hearing aids compared to people who didn't have hearing impairment. And they looked at education and class, and it didn't make any difference. All of the figures were the same. So it doesn't just seem as we are looking at people who are more highly educated. They also they considered people for more than 10 years later compared to those less than 10 years, in case of what we're just looking at a couple of years before is people who are not responding to cues when their hearing is tested because they can't understand them, whether they're actually developing dementia. And again, that made no difference. That's really good evidence that using hearing aids prevents dementia. And another study showed that people who had hearing loss, they followed up people from when they got hearing aids, and their fall in cognition was quite rapid, which was stopped by using hearing aids. So it's a really big thing, and and it makes a huge difference. And I was just saying that I got an email from NHS England this morning asking, do I think that we should be instituting screening for hearing, and if so, at what age? And I'm talking to them about this next week, because there are things we can do that really make a difference. Just want to talk a bit more about education and cognitive stimulation. We've known for a long time that education is important for the cognitive reserve, and it makes sense, doesn't it? It builds up, physically, it builds up your neurons, and it gives you an ability to use good strategies and to have some idea of what, when you read things in newspapers, whether they're likely to be right or wrong, and on the internet. My colleague, Mika Kivamaki, published in the BMJ a paper recently, who found, and for the first time, because of the very large number of people followed up, he was able to show that while people who didn't have much education but had cognitively stimulating jobs, had a decreased rate of dementia. So it's not just childhood education, sorry, it's adulthood as well. And he looked at and found the mechanism about proteins, which you probably don't need to think about it. There's also some evidence that retirement may increase deterioration, even if you allow for ill health. So countries with younger retirement ages tend to have more dementia at a lower age. So President Macron, maybe you're right about increasing the retirement age. Moving on to smoking, which was the third. You'll not find a doctor who tells you it's a good idea to smoke. We know that it leads to cardiovascular pathology, and smoke contains neurotoxins. There's a high prevalence, although it's massively decreased, not decreased in low and middle income countries where there's less laws about it. There's a 32-year follow-up of the Whitehall cohort found that ex-smokers reduced their risk, so stopping smoking made a difference, and the ex-smokers reverted over years to the same risk as non-smokers. And a Korean nationwide study found that the people who stopped smoking 2 years later had no increased risk of dementia. So stopping smoking makes a difference. Depression. Depression is complicated. Depression increases the risk of dementia, but as people are developing dementia, they often become depressed. However, the UK Biobank, again, with their 500,000 people in it, were able to find over 46,000 people with a diagnosis of depression, and those treated for depression had a much lower risk than those people who were untreated. And that didn't matter whether the treatment was drugs or psychotherapy or both. And people who got better, even without treatment, were also at a lower risk. So there's very high evidence that treating depression makes a difference. Air pollution, my colleagues are going to talk about it in a bit more detail than I'm going to. But just to say, there are several studies, including in France, the States and China, showing that decreasing the level of air pollution compared to other populations where it has not decreased, decreases the risk of dementia and decreases the risk of cognitive deterioration. High blood pressure, Trials for high blood pressure, randomized controlled trials, are always stopped because the people in the non-intervention groups tend to do so much worse. So they're always stopped. But putting them all together, it's very clear that treating high blood pressure reduces the risk of dementia. Treating it in midlife reduces the risk of dementia. So what I'm telling you, I'm trying to tell you there are risk factors, but we don't just know there are risks. We know that changing the risk factors changes the outcome. Use of hearing aid decreases risk. Reducing air pollution decreases risk. Treating high blood pressure reduces risk. While people without education but high cognitively stimulating jobs reduces risk. Stopping smoking reduces risk. And it's really important to target people at risk, because trials have tended to take high income, highly educated people who agreed to be randomized. They're not likely to develop dementia. And like one of my PPI said to me, I'm in a trial for Mediterranean diet. And I said to her, and how's that going? I'm in the non-intervention group, but obviously I'm eating a Mediterranean diet. It'd be crazy not to. So we need to get the people who aren't just going to change in trials. I just want you to have a quick look at this. This is New Zealand. People in different ethnic groups have different risks, and Maori and Pacific people in New Zealand have much greater risk than East Asian and European. And this is Brazil. People in poorer regions have much more risk than people in wealthier regions. This is a paper we did with our health economic friends, and they costed how much it would cost to screen everyone in midlife and give them hearing aids. Same with hypertension, and the same with smoking cessation and preventing diabetes. And what we found is that if the first three, so not diabetes, we costed them for England because you have to cost it for somewhere, is that you get an 8.5% reduction in dementia prevalence with 2.4 billion per year saving in health, social and unpaid care. So while preventing diabetes would not be worth it just for dementia alone, because we use the cost and the number of people you prevent it for, but it probably would be worth it for many, many other interventions, many other diseases. So the United States has used our evidence and they have now got, as part of their policy that they have with the CDC, and they've got targets for risk factors, and they think over the next 10 years, I think, to 2030, and they expect to have 15% decreased risk in dementia using our things, and they expect that 2 million people will have been saved from having Alzheimer's disease by 2050. So they're taking it, and they're taking their policy. In England, it's become part of the dementia check to say to, not dementia, the midlife check, to look at people and say, this may help you, changing this for you may make a difference in you developing dementia. My message for all of you is to be ambitious about prevention. Any disease modifying treatment will not remove the need for prevention. They will be expensive and have side effects, and we'd all prefer not to have an illness rather than to have a 2-week infusion. 40% and more is potentially preventable. There's clear strategies to help already. I've mentioned hearing aids, smoking cessation, blood pressure, pollution, depression. Tackling risk will provide more years of healthy life. So people will eventually get unhealthy and die. We're not offering eternal life, but what people want is years of healthy life rather than years of unhealthy life. And it's also what the economy wants. It may, for some people, it will prevent dementia ever occurring, and it will save money. And the most vulnerable stand to gain the most, and that has to be part of policy. This is UCL, where I come from. Thank you for your attention. I can and do talk for hours about this, but I've tried to compress information as well as compress morbidity. But thank you very much for your attention and for inviting me here.